Hello, everybody, for today's talk. I'm Dionysios Perdikis, and I have Marius Pille on my right, as I can see on my screen. Um, Today, we're gonna talk about the brain network model optimization, which is mainly what Marius is gonna talk about, and then we're gonna spend lesser time, about 20 minutes, on multiscale simulation. Which is my part. And then we hope that there will be some time for discussion and maybe some hands-on as well. So for the moment, we're 16. Maybe we can wait a couple of minutes more, or maybe Marius, you can start with the overview, and in the meantime, there might be more people.
Yeah, maybe we can slowly start and just get going. Yeah, so quick overview about what we will talk about today. So we talk or motivate a little bit why we model at all. I mean, probably most or a lot of motivations you have already seen in all the other talks, which maybe already applied brain network modeling to a specific use case. We will take a bit bigger picture and then also have like a small recap about the models we use. And finally, we will look into different inference methods using TVB-Optim, the optimization tool that we developed over the past years, I would say. And after that, Dionysios will give you an overview about what is beyond like simple brain network modeling and how you can make the simulations even more complex, but also more realistic. And then we will have some time for questions and eventually maybe also for a quick hands-on. So let's see how it works out. Okay, so first, let us draw maybe a little map of inference. So why do we model at all? In neuroscience, we often can measure certain modalities, like the most typical ones are EEG, MEG, fMRI, but there are also a bunch of other measurements. But these are also only like very coarse aggregates about the actual mechanism or the actual working of the neurons that are part of our brain. So we have these observed signals on the one side, but we are mainly interested in what's going actually on in the brain and to get like a glimpse into what mechanisms are working there and uh, test our hypotheses about what is going on there. We turn to modeling, and in this case, brain network modeling. We express like certain assumptions how the brain works in a mathematical format and have this as a model. And there's always like some parts that we neglect or simplify in modeling. So this is like the whole art of modeling is to justify and also have a good understanding what you can like leave aside for the moment, but still get reasonable results. And this process of from observed signals gaining an understanding by our mechanistic model is what we call inference. And this modeling itself is already kind of like formulating a hypothesis with regard to some specific questions. And then we have like this inverse problem, which is parameterized in our case, and we can infer some parameters, some values from the data. Yeah, so this is in a way our hypothesis. And then I like this like picture to explain or to predict. So there's this nice paper which is about general statistics, but it also groups the different schools, so to say, that exist in brain network modeling. Like on the one side, there's like people that try to figure out what mechanism is going on. So we have formed like different models, rivaling models that maybe show one mechanism and the other, and then we test them to data, for example, in a Bayesian approach, and then we can pick like a winner, so the model that better describes the data. And I think the canonical work here is this like dynamic causal modeling that was made or introduced by Carl Friston. And the deliverable here is kind of like a winning hypothesis, so actually understanding a mechanism. And the second predictive or counterfactual way is like asking what if. So in this approach, we often fit to like a single subject, maybe in some like measured or observed state. And then the plan is to simulate like interventions. And the canonical paper here is kind of like this digital brain twin approach. I think the lecture series is also called like this. And the main idea is that in this like digital twin, we can test interventions that we cannot so easily test in humans. So this like counterfactual is basically simulating, for example, a drug or a resection in epilepsy or some form of stimulation that we did not actually measure. That would be the factual, but which we can model in a mechanistic way. And so the question is, what can we actually learn? And this is also a little bit of a disclaimer. So fitting, a very vague word, it's very powerful, but it's not like a truth machine. It's always like you're formulating, and what you get out is like a quantity to your question that you ask. But this does not mean that the question that you ask is inherently or has to be inherently useful, and it's very is to be crafted very carefully, and there are many pitfalls involved. So very common thing that we can encounter is like degeneracy. If we like state our questions too vaguely, we can find multiple solutions or multiple answers to the same questions, and maybe we did not learn anything at all in this case. And then there's also like this caveat that only if we can fit something really well does not mean that we can predict automatically correctly. So only because we can fit resting state does not mean that we can easily predict the effect of an intervention. We have to be careful to make it useful. So it's kind of like a craft to formulate these questions, and this is kind of what science is about. And inference is the tools that we can use to answer these questions. And here's already an example that we will encounter later in our running problem that we will look at through different lenses. So we have like a solution landscape of two parameters that we fitted, so to say. And we can see there's this like yellow shaded area, this like a region of solutions. So there's like this parameter set 1 and parameter set 2, but they deliver the same functional connectivity, and functional connectivity was the observable in this problem case. So if we want to now interpret these like theta 1 and theta 2, we have to be very careful or need more information to make it really useful. Okay, now a quick recap on brain network modeling. I think in the lecture series there was like a thorough introduction, but we will recap quickly under the lens of fitting or inversion. So the first building block is basically the local dynamics. We have like these mean field models, in this case Janssen-Ritt model that is supposed or was derived from the actual dynamics of a whole population of neurons, which would be too expensive to model. So we turn to this like simpler model, which we then call neural mass or mean field model. And this model has like certain parameters, and these are like in its differential equation. It can be like local dynamical parameter, but also external input and the coupling or noise that we will also see later. And these parameters define the behavior, and these parameters are also the target of our inference or fitting. And we now have like these local dynamics, and what we do is we couple them into a whole brain network model. So this is like the general equation, but the idea is that we take structural data from tractography, we superpose a parcellation, and then we get like a brain network, which is basically a connectivity matrix and also like a delay matrix that tells us how strong all the different dynamical models are connected. And for example, how long it takes for a signal to travel from one region to the other. And of course, there can also be like some nonlinear coupling. For example, a sigmoidal that enforces some boundaries, and therefore the coupling itself can have additional parameters. So in a way, it looks like this. Coupling collects all the input from all the other regions and applies some transformation and then adds it into our target region. And that process happens for all the region, which gives us our network dynamical system. And also a lot of new parameters. Like we have these global ones, which is like a single scalar scaling factor for the coupling. But in the extreme case, we could also infer per node connections. So potentially we have like thousands parameters available to fit in our model. And we have, most of the time we also have even more parameters because we rarely use the simulated time series directly. Often we have an additional observation model. It could be like some balloon wind castle model that gives you from your neural activity a slower bolt signal. So if you measured fMRI, you transform a time series, or you have some lead field matrix that projects your raw neural activity from a source into sensor space, so you can more easily compare it to your data. And then you apply additional aggregations maybe as well. And this gives you another set of parameters that you could potentially fit. Okay, and we infer through this like whole pipeline and select different parameters. So how do we now do the fitting? We already had this, like this modeling is like formulating a hypothesis and picking which parameter we want to model is actually already a meaningful part of the whole modeling process. And on a very high level, this inference workflow can look like this. We selected some parameter set of our brain network model. Then we apply potentially our observation function, which maybe gives us like some functional connectivity data. And we compare this into a loss function to some measured data. So this is the very much simplified look on modeling and inference. The question is then, which set of parameters is consistent with the data? So often we want to find like a parameter or a set of parameters, or maybe also a distribution of parameters that fits the data well. And there like plethora of methods exist to do this. And one example is for like this very simple case, gradient descent, where we start somewhere and in the end find a solution. And we will now look at all the different methods that are available to us to answer this problem, and maybe also compare like what are the pros and cons, and maybe when one can use it and when we should maybe use different methods. But all these methods have the same kind of requirements. We need to define some form of loss function or some form of comparison to some empirical data. And then we have to like test very many combinations of parameters to find the set that minimizes or finds the best fit to the loss function. And there are smarter and less smart ways to this like testing of many combinations. But with this mental model, we can like cover most inference methods. And maybe a short intersection why this is often hard for brain network models. So first, our simulations can get quite expensive. So a single forward simulation can already take like seconds or minutes. And for inference, we often need like many simulations. So a lot of compute potentially. Also, if we want to increase realism, we often get more and more parameters. For example, if we want to make the brain heterogeneous, so each region behaves a little bit different, you already have like n, the number of nodes of parameters. So the problems can become high dimensional. We often have like non-smooth dynamics. So we have, or there's this like theory that the brain operates on like critical points, or these critical points are often placed at, for example, bifurcations. So the brain can easily switch between different states. And this makes the problem potentially more different because it's not very smooth, the loss landscape. And the observables themselves are in a way bumpy because they are often described by summary statistics. So a bit of aggregation already happened. And then we have this like parameter degeneracy. There's not like a single parameter that explains the whole behavior. Often it's a combination of parameters, but they can also be dependent on each other. So it's not so easy to find a unique solution. And every method that you can use and that you will now see is kind of a bet which of these difficulties dominate and how you want to tackle them. And to make inference easier, so the first thing is a faster simulator makes it easy and can get faster by just having faster code, but also parallelization can help and accelerators like GPUs can help to achieve this. Then one thing that we will later see that can help, especially with this like high dimensional inference problems, is if you have differentiable code. So you can do gradient descent through your whole modeling pipeline. And workflows can also help. So there are good steps that you can do in some order that then can guide you slowly through this optimization process while building and refining your model. And we tackled these problems with our tool that you can later also see in this slide, and you can also find on GitHub, which we called TVB Optim, which is basically a JAX-based implementation of the virtual brain. And we will apply this to an example problem. And the example problem looks like this. So we have fMRI data, and therefore we have like a functional connectivity. And we selected like two parameters that we want to fit. We selected two for this lecture because with two parameters, you can get nice plots. You get like these landscapes that you just saw, but it's already complex enough that it can demonstrate like the most important pitfalls and also how to solve them. And for the loss function, we just compare our empirical functional connectivity to the one that we simulated with the reduced Wang model with the root mean square error. So a very standard loss function. And the whole thing looks like this. So this is our empirical data that we have. And I mean, in this case, it's easy. It's just two parameters. We already know the solution beforehand, but it's still educational to look at it through like the different lenses. So we get this like rich shaped loss landscape where there's always like a good combination of global coupling and excitatory recurrence that gives us a good fit. And this example can be defined in TVOptim. Like one way is to define it directly in TVOptim, but you can also bring your TVB simulation and then use the TVB ontology to convert in between. So this is like a JAX-based toolbox, which from the building blocks is very similar to TVB, but the names are sometimes a little bit different. So instead of a connectivity, you have a graph, and then you have like the same dynamics you have in TVB, like this reduced one network, and we have some linear coupling. We add some noise to the simulation, as we always do, because it drives the dynamics and explains a little bit all the things that we neglected in our modeling. And then we couple all these things together in a dynamical network. And then it gets a little bit different compared to standard TVB, because for this like differentiability or this JAX-based approach, we have like this prepare function, which splits the whole simulation that we defined into like a computational graph, which we called a model here, and a state, which is like all the parameters, all the initial conditions that define this model are in this state. And this is important because now we have a pure function, which is the computational graph, which is the dynamical system and the solver basically. And JAX can do some nice transformations with this, and we will see later how this can be useful. And from here, we can build in complexity. Like a typical pattern is we have a simulation and then we wrap it to build more complex models. So now we have an observation where we reduce the model and wrap it and put it to like a bolt monitor. And from the bolt signal, we compute the functional connectivity. And then we can do the same thing. This time we wrap the observation and compare it to the empirical target. But we always keep like this form that we have like a pure function, which is only dependent on the state, so the parameters, so to say, of our model. And the first nice thing that JAX gives us, and this formalism gives us, that we can parallelize very easily. So we define the model once, and then we can parallelize either on single machine, but we can also parallelize over multiple nodes. And for this, we designed like a simple syntax. So very simple example, the 10 by 10 grid is, we define so-called axes, and we will see different axes over time, which we place in our state. So here, example parameter theta1 and theta2 both become an axis now. And then we have this like parallel execution, which reduces the loss that we just defined for a single state, but we can now apply it over like the whole space that we spanned. So somewhat like this, we defined like this 10 by 10 space, which is a simple grid. And then we can evaluate it in parallel and get for each state like a value, in this case, the loss function that we just defined. And this is the first pattern. And with this pattern, we can already use many, many inference methods that are very, or optimization methods, so to say. And we will now go to them. And yeah, the benefit can be like really huge. Just parallelizing on the CPU gives already a very good speed up. But if we then switch to like one or even like multiple GPUs, we can basically finish like the whole evaluation of this like parameter grid in a time that is much faster than like a single simulation on a CPU. So this is something that we get for free by using JAX, because it has like these code transformations that we can apply if we have like pure function. I think the easiest approach, which is also very, driving a lot of the papers that were written about TV is like this classical grid search. We have this like grid that rely on our parameters, and then we just run many simulations and get some results. The downside is that the cost grows depending on how many parameters you have. So every new dimension gives you a multiplier in the number of simulations you have to run. But syntactically, it's very easy. So you again define these like grids, this time the real grids in W and G. You get the space and you can evaluate it, and then we retrieve our loss landscape for our problem that we defined. Already very good upgrade. So instead of just exploring the grid, we do random search. And the interesting finding is here that often, if we selected some parameters might not be so important to the problem. And we only know that after the fact, so after we did our exploration. And random search works a little bit around it by scattering the values around. We do not spend all the compute in always the same places, but distribute it a little bit and learn much more about our independent or it's also dependent variables. And if we apply this to our two-dimensional problem, it would look like this. So instead of a grid axis, we just put a uniform axis in there. So now the values are not from grid, but sampled. We can put any distribution in here in theory, but the pattern stays the same. We have this like uniform axis, then create a space and run the same execution in parallel. And then it looks like this. So this is now the random exploration overlaid with the grid. And we can see that just by chance, we already found like some of the best fits, but we only spent like 1/10 of the compute in samples here compared to the full landscape. The next upgrade is this, instead of just using random numbers, we can use like quasi-random numbers. For example, Sobol sequence. They are like kind of random, but not completely random. And they have the nice property that after we simulated them all, we can do all this plotting that we already saw, but we can also do like some sensitivity analysis. For example, in Python, there's this salib that we can easily plug into the scheme. So we define now a problem. This just comes from this like library that some other people created. And we can plug this into our axis. So this is now the way the samples were created. And we can plug these samples into our data axis and evaluate them in the same parallel way. But instead of just getting the losses here, we can also do this like Sobol analysis, and then gives us sensitivity. And sensitivity means here how important is this parameter for this kind of question. And question means the FC loss that we just asked. And just for fun, we added like a third parameter here, which is sigma. This is the strength of the noise. And it turns out it's not so important for this parameter regime. So yeah, we learned here already that we don't have to include it, but the G and W that we selected before are important. So they both have like a high coefficient, but we also get like second order coefficients, and those already tell us that G and W are highly correlated, and potentially one could be removed. So this already tells us something about degeneracy potentially. Lets us further restrict our parameter space. Next step is evolutionary approaches. So maybe you have already heard about them because they're very common in very many domains. And there are multiple libraries that you can use for that. But the general idea is always that we have like some population, in this case, a population of parameters. And each generation, the next values are informed from the previous one. So it's kind of like a smarter search. We can actually learn from generation to generation something. And this fits into the same pattern, but it scales already to a lot higher parameter dimension. So just to quickly show you, this is the same pattern reappearing. We have like some way to create parameters we want to test. We can plug it into our model with our axis and then quickly in parallel execute those. And then we get some results. And for this case, it looks like this. So here over the different populations, you can see how it quickly narrows down on this like linear ridge and then tends to explore the ridge. And so it also like tries to go new ways. This is like this random factor that is built in, but in the end it converges. And we can also already see like one problem that can arise. So W is the excitatory recurrence, but we can already see that it drifts towards zero and probably also into negative. And just by turning negative, the meaning of the parameter is probably no longer excitatory, but turned inhibitory. So this is kind of a case where we did ask the question, maybe not careful enough, and we would need to add like further restrictions to keep this positive and conserve the meaning of the parameter. Because just applying like an inference method or optimization method does not really care about the meaning of those parameters. We need to care about those. And yeah, with this, we can scale to like maybe 50 parameters, depending on the problem and how much they are correlated. But if we want to fit more parameters, we hit kind of a wall with just sampling or search-based approaches. And for these high-dimensional parameters that you can get just by turning the brain models that we defined heterogeneous, so each region has its own parameter, can have easily like thousands or 10,000 of parameters. And for those, you need differentiability or gradient descent. And yeah, the magic behind this is so-called automatic differentiation, which means gradient almost for free. I won't dive into the math, but the general idea is that we run the model forward and then do this so-called backpropagation and backpropagate the discrepancy, so the error and the loss, all the way through our simulation back into the parameter. And this has the really nice property that this automatic differentiation, the cost of running it is independent or mostly independent from the number of parameters that we choose. So each gradient costs roughly 3 to 30 times the cost it just costs to simulate the forward model. And this is also the technology that drives like all these large language models or big neural networks. This is how they learn. And we just reuse this machinery. So here you can see if you use like this reverse mode automatic differentiation and test different number of free parameters, it basically stays the same, which is a nice property to have. And in JAX, it's also very easy. So we don't need to really understand how it works. We can just use this code transformation again. So we defined the loss function, and now we can transform it and get the gradient of the loss function, which is just very nice software engineering from JAX that we reuse here. And if we have gradients, we can also do different algorithm. For example, we can do gradient descent. And gradient descent basically works. We start at some point, then we look at the gradient, and the gradient tells us in which way the loss is reduced. And then we walk a step in this direction and get the next set of parameters. And this way, we can quickly walk the loss landscape, also in a very high dimensional parameter setting. The thing is, we need like a good starting point, and we'll end up with like a single estimate. So as you will later see, maybe first take a look at how we do it in our toolbox. So now instead of placing the axis in our state, we just define it a parameter, and then we can just use the same loss function that we used for all the other methods, put it into the optimizer. In this case, we use a very classical add-on, but there are different things that you can pick, and we run it for a defined number of steps, which gives us a fitted set of parameters. And this is the figure that you already saw, where we start at some point and then we quickly travel through this ridge. But here it also does not give us the whole ridge. It only gives us this trajectory that it traveled through space. And you can also see here that eventually it would travel easily into like the negative region, so we suffer from the same potential problem. But with the same approach, or with this like gradients available, we could also do Bayesian inference. So if these like point estimates that we get are not enough for us, and we actually want to learn the full distribution about the parameters, so the actual shape of the ridge, we can turn to Bayesian methods. And maybe a quick refresher on how this like Bayesian rule works. So the thing is, in Bayesian approaches, we start with something that we call prior. So this actually forces to encode the knowledge that we have about parameter before we do any modeling, kind of. And then we get something that we call the posterior, which is the new distribution of this parameter after it has seen the data. So after we showed it the data, we learned potentially something, the posterior shrunk, and we now know, okay, this parameter with respect, or after seeing this data, is centered around this with this standard deviation. And there are different levels to encode your knowledge. So for example, you can also say, okay, I don't know nothing about a parameter, so I give it like a very uninformative prior. And maybe I know some bounds. For example, for our W, we know it should stay positive, so we cut it off at 0 and maybe at some very high value. But maybe we also already know, like from literature, some values. Maybe we know the healthy range for some parameter, or like neurotransmitter concentration, or whatever is a parameter in our model. And then we can literally bake this into our model, or we can even have like very strong priors. So if we have like a stimulus that we set in our device, or some receptor density maps that we measured, that can become a very strong prior, and we can embed this information into our model. And this gives us very much power to put information into the model, but it also changes the dynamics a little bit, because now we have like a single simulator, on a single set of data, but depending on how much information we put in here, the results that we get can be quite different. And this crafting of priors has also been done carefully, and also has to be disclosed in the experiment and the publications you do, because otherwise you can also do easily cheating by crafting your priors to get the results that you want. So this helps, but this does not solve like good scientific practice. And we looked at two methods here. So one method is Hamiltonian Monte Carlo sampling, which is kind of the gold standard Bayesian inference method. And then we also looked at a stochastic variational inference, which is kind of simplification and a little bit cheaper computationally. And the problem that we defined here is we have again our G and W, and put just a uniform distribution similar to the grid that we also explored. And if we run these, you can see that HMC nicely covers like this ridge. So here we get a distribution of parameters, and it covered this. But we can also see it's reaching here into the negative. But at least it learned like the shape of this like degeneracy and actually tells us the true picture. It took 4 hours to run this, and SVI, which is like the simplified version, which just assumed like some Gaussians that have like some covariance between them. It can also learn this ridge because it's like linear, but if it would be a little bit more non-linear, this one would struggle to actually capture this like curvature of this ridge potentially. But it was much faster, and we got a similar result. And this is also already like the main cost that you pay for Bayesian approaches. So the gradient-based optimization that you just saw runs really quickly. You can maybe later see it in the hands-on session, a few seconds to a minute, but actually getting a posterior is computationally much more demanding. So you always have to trade off and select the right approach for your problem. Maybe one further limitation, because this is something that we are actually working on at the moment. So if you have chaotic dynamics in your model, which can happen, and some people actually want to model this and say the brain can behave chaotic in certain pathologies or certain states, this actually destroys our automatic differentiation approach. And just a simple picture. So this is now the Janssen-Ritt model that we saw initially. And we just look at the global coupling. And we can see that for the global coupling and the functional connectivity metric, there is like an optimum here. And this optimum, where the model fits best, roughly sits at this transition where the Lyapunov exponent turned from negative to positive. And if you maybe remember or not, I'll tell you now, this is one hallmark of chaotic dynamics, having a positive Lyapunov exponent. And this is also the region in the model where it goes from fixed point dynamics into oscillating dynamics. So this is also the bifurcation point of the network or of the Janssen-Ritt model. And this is nice that it all falls together, but unfortunately, it also falls together with where our gradient breaks down. So initially, we can learn, we can go in this direction, but then it either shows in the wrong direction or even can explode. So give you like non-numerical values, and then you cannot use these like gradient-based approaches so easily here. This is very unfortunate because we care about these regimes and we want to fit those. So we are working on this, and there are different approaches. For example, if you remember this like butterfly effect, or this is like a representation of this like butterfly effect. If you have like a short change after some time, you will have very different outcomes. And one way to deal with this is only look like short steps ahead, where this like very drastic difference is not yet present. And some tricks you can actually learn into these regimes, but yeah, this is still kind of work in progress. Something that's more established for this kind of dynamics is, or something that you can always imply, even if you have like no gradient or non-differentiable models, black box models, is so-called simulation-based inference. And this is also a Bayesian approach. So you again can bring your priors, but now we can put in any simulator. We don't need gradients, which we needed for the other Bayesian methods. And we just run it for very, very many different sets of parameters. So we get like a huge set of time series and related FC matrices in our case, and then return something that's called a neural density estimator on those simulated time series. And from there, we can then get the priors or the posteriors with respect to some data in the same way that we saw for the other Bayesian approach. And this is nice because if you can simulate, you can apply this method, therefore simulation-based inference. But it also has other nice properties. So you can like train it once on very many simulations, and then you can quickly evaluate like new data that you retrieved. So if you have like many new patients that you want to evaluate, you can learn the model once, and then evaluating new patients can be faster, which can be very useful for some settings. Okay, maybe tying it all back, we now have seen very many optimization or inference methods that all have different advantages, even like grid search. The main advantage that you get like nice plots if you apply this method. But we still have to like select it with respect to actual question that we want to solve and how many parameters are probably involved, and also how much compute we have available to this. So this is kind of like a little cheat sheet, probably not true for all edge cases, but maybe a rough orientation in the context of brain network modeling. Virtual twins, as we also like, cheap to also say. One final thing to maybe make it more approachable, we have in TV Optim a so-called workflow. So you don't have to decide upfront what method you use, but you can easily build your inference pipeline incrementally. So kind of looks like this. So something that you can always do is some bifurcation analysis of your like single node dynamics. And from that, you often already get like a parameter range where you have like bistability maybe. So the model can do some switching. And this can inform like your choice of parameters already. Then it's often a good idea to do like a coarse search. So either grid, if you have like few parameters and want to plot, or like some random searches, whole searches. So you already know which parameters are important, where are the areas that give good fits. And from there, you can do, if you want to have like even better fits, you can do some more refinement and turn to like gradient-based methods. So instead of having like a single parameter here, you can turn like global parameter and a per region parameter and learn this starting from one already good value. Or you can, from there, define your Bayesian pipeline and actually learn the whole posterior distribution and posterior distribution, and then also define the uncertainty and have some more powerful statistical claims that you can make from there. And this can be built incrementally. So it's like not completely cookie cutter, but a good orientation to just start easy and then get more and more complex as your problem requires maybe. Okay. So quick takeaway from this block. We have a network model, and defining the model is already like defining kind of a hypothesis that we ask to our data. And the same is with the selection of parameters. It's asking a question, and we use inference then to hopefully answer this question. And depending on how difficult the question we ask is, we need different methods. Can be like from grid search to genetic approaches, or this like gradient-based approach if we have many parameters. Or if you're interested in more sound statistical claims, you can also turn to Bayesian or simulation-based inference. method that give you a posterior. You can use TV-Optim for that, which gives you like these nice high-level approaches of easily doing parallel optimizations, but also gives you a differentiable code. So it's quite adaptable to these different methods. And if you use a workflow, it's always a good starting point, and you can adapt it or can get started on your problem. But this does not solve all problems. You can always run into like these identifiability problems, meaning you are not 100% sure if a phenomenon is caused by one thing or another. And there you maybe need to bring in more information, more domain knowledge, bring it into your modeling as a constraint, as a prior, and make a question in a way sharper. So it's kind of also an iterative process. Yeah, and with this, I stop for now and hand over to Dennis.
So this part of the talk is going to be about TVB Multiscale, which is a software for co-simulating the virtual brain with spiking networks. Actually, I will not get so much into the software itself, but only talk some basic principles, and I'll explain to you in the end why. So, first of all, what we mean by co-simulation of TVB and spiking networks is practically when we create a model that most of the brain is modeled in as the virtual brain with using neural mass models, but some regions, some specific circuits of the brain we model with more detail as spiking networks, and then we simulate together the two models while they interact at real time. So one question is, why would that be useful? So as you must have already understood from the talks till now, the virtual brain is based on modeling and simulating the brain at a level of detail that allows the model to generate virtual data that can be compared with the modern neuroimaging data we get from neuroscience. So it can link theory and reality, the data, through this generative modeling approach. And you saw just now with Marius talk that it works the other way around. Once you can compare virtual data with real data, you can also go back and optimize the model or adjust it to the actual data. And you can actually do that at the individual level also. So in that respect, TVB is a state-of-the-art brain anatomical and functional data to neuroimaging data. However, we all know that there are a lot of other simulators and a lot of studies that actually model specific neural systems at a more finer scale, that of actual populations of spiking neurons. So the question is, when is really necessary to combine these two approaches? And here the idea is that on the one hand, we need to actually need the specific detail that the spiking network can offer, like synchronization phenomena or plasticity phenomena, etc. So on the other hand, we need to embed this in a whole brain model and actually benefit from the interaction between the two levels of description. Another very important conceptual neuron level, then we need to bridge these two levels at the mesoscale of the population level, the population of neurons, or a specific small network. And this is the case because on the one hand, the state variables of TVB usually summarize the dynamics of subfield approach At the same time, we can compute such average activity of populations of spiking neurons with statistical means. And therefore, at this level, we can have quantities that actually mean the same, such that they connect notions to be placed somewhere in the TVB brain, to be part of it. But I'll come back to this. So first, I want to show you a couple of applications that we have already performed using this approach, and that has already led to a couple of publications. So the most recent one is a study we have just submitted for review. Here you can find the bioarchive uh, version and have a look that have shown that when the cerebellum is removed or deactivated actually with, and this is a case actually where a specific mechanism that happens on the cerebellum, which we modeled as a spiking network, actually causes something to change in the cortical interaction. So the whole loop is really necessary on the one hand, the specific mechanism of cerebellum is of interest on the other hand. I won't go into details of the study, you can go and read it, but you can see that the cerebellum was modeled as a spiking network using the NES simulator, whereas the cortex was modeled in TVB. And we actually validated the model against data that we got qualitatively from another publication, such that we could reproduce the power spectra or the coherence drop itself when the cerebellum gets deactivated, both on a TVB only model, where the cerebellum was also modeled as a neural mass, and with a multiscale co-simulation. This allowed us also then to observe the activity of both neural masses and spiking networks. And what followed actually was that after validation, we started making perturbation and lesion studies on the spiking network, so we could start cutting connections or deactivated populations, seeing what changes in the cerebellum and how this modulates the sensory motor coherence in the cortex. In another example that was a bit earlier, we used another spiking simulator, Anarchy, in combination always with TVB. And the study had to do, this is already published, with virtual deep brain stimulation. In this case, uh, what we had modeled in Anarchy was actually the basal ganglia and the thalamus. Again, the cortex was modeled in TVB. And we had data from, so spiking models that were fit against data of control and against Parkinson's disease patients. And then we also modeled the stimulation of the basal ganglia, and we could observe the improvement in the firing rates of the spiking populations. And at the same time, due to the multiscale model, we could see what changed in the activations of the whole cortical sheet. You can also find this study online. I'm sorry, give me a second. Finally, we are actively developing an interface also with NetPine. NetPine is a Python interface for Neuron, which is the most developed spiking simulator. It can also model for multicompartmental neurons. And here we don't have yet a published study, but we have implemented toy models. So this is actually an active field of development. And you can play with the tool yourself. if you go to the eBrains platform, and there you can find the tool installed and notebooks where you can run. You can also find the code. I can share the slides with you later on so you can get everything. So yeah, you can find the code in GitHub, and some Docker images prepared with all the environment installed. Let me get into some of the aspects of the science and the engineering behind the implementation of such a model. So first of all, as I said, for us, it's TVB, the center of the attention, and the spiking network has to be, let's say, incorporated in a specific brain region, or more than one, maybe. This means that the two directions of the interaction are not treated the same way. Spiking network is a kind of coupling. So the idea is that some or all of the brain regions that are modeled in TVB couple to, so send data to the spiking network that is supposed to reside in some TVB region. In the other way, though, it's not really a thing. It's first an update that is more specific state variables, in other words, of the thalamus in TVB with the activity that is coming from the spiking thalamus. And then this region is treated as any other region in the TVB connectome, and so it can change, actually it can send data to all other regions through the TVB coupling method you must know by now. Now the question is, how can we do that? So obviously there is a point where we need to do transformations from neural mass activity that can be something like current or membrane potential, or even a dimensionless quantity or a firing rate. And this somehow needs to be translated into spiking activity. So there is this module here that can perform functions. Quantity, they play the role of a proxy of a TVB node. So it's like if every TVB node has its own ghost, a proxy inside the spiking network. And then what can happen is that the activity in time of some state variable, that might mean rate, for instance, of this TVB node is scaled or goes through other algebraic transform or whatever, and then parameterizes a device that converts rates to spikes, usually some Poisson generator here of spikes. In this case, every TVB node has to have its own proxy inside the spiking network. And then the coupling of this device towards the spiking population targets has to happen with connectivity weight and delay determined by the TVB connectome. Okay, so the delays and weights that you saw from the big connectivity matrices are taken into consideration inside the spiking network in this case. However, there can be also a more economic, cheaper approach computationally, in which case what we convey from TVB to NEST is actually already the coupling that needs to be applied to the target region. So in this case, the coupling is already computed in TVB like for any other TVB node. It is the coupling that is actually transformed into spikes, and then it is applied just in time without any delay and without any additional weight to the target spiking region. On the other way, and obviously this is a cheaper case because we need only one proxy for every receiving node. So if we have 100 TVP nodes and only 5 of them are modeled in a spiking as a spiking network, we need only 5 proxies, while in the other case we would need 95. So, but the implementations are different because there are here the coupling is already computed. So we wanted to include in the model some processing of plasticity or whatever. This wouldn't work in this case. Anyway, on the other direction, as we said, is an update. So what we really need to do is that for every brain region modeled in as a spiking one, we need to record spikes. It can be also we record currents, but the general case is that we record spikes. And these recording devices also act like a TVB proxy in this case. And then in small time windows, this counting of spikes is converted again to some continuous variable that can be transformed into the specific state variable of the neural mass model that is used in TVB. So if this was a spiking thalamus again, this will update at every time point the corresponding TVB thalamus, and then this TVB thalamus can connect, as we said, with all other TVB regions without any other modification. So that means it is essential that it's the coupling variable that is updated, right? Because this is the variable that will be communicated to the other brain regions. Another important aspect of such co-simulation models is the fact that we need to synchronize data between the two networks, the neural mass and the spiking one, um, after we perform all necessary transformations, of course. And here, obviously, the ideal scenario would be that we actually parallelize the two simulators. And to be honest, we have done this, sorry, but we didn't have a great benefit till now because it's obvious that usually the bottleneck is the spiking simulation, which is slower. So we don't gain a lot when we parallelize the simulation. Also, it's usual that we use a smaller time step for the spiking network because usually the spiking dynamics is faster than the neural mass ones. What we usually do right now is to actually alternate. So we simulate TVB, we send data to the spiking network, we simulate the spiking network, we send back data to TVB, etc. And the good thing is we don't need to do this for every time step because there is this minimum time delay in TVB. Since usually the connections are delayed, there's usually a minimum time delay, and that means we can actually synchronize every minimum delay time and not at every time step. So the less instances of synchronization, the faster the whole simulation, of course. So I won't get into more details, as I said, and the reason is that I think, and we think with Marius, that the future for this kind of modeling is actually in the direction of what you saw earlier in Marius' talk. In other words, it is one thing to simulate, but obviously, usually we need the simulations to actually fit a model, right? To be able to adjust the model to our data, to be able to get in some inference. And this is hard when the model, the simulator is so heterogeneous, like it is the case of what I showed you. Practically, when you interface TVB with a different software, it's obviously impossible to know exactly what is happening. And certainly such a thing is not differentiable. So we cannot use all this machinery that Mario showed. But apparently, now we are working in the direction of writing our own code and creating differentiable code for TVB and spiking networks, heterogeneous networks. And we are at the point that we are now discussing how to do it and to solve design problems. And I thought that at this point I could stop talking maybe and open a discussion. Maybe you want to give, I mean, given your knowledge until now on brain simulation and spiking network simulation, maybe we can open a discussion at this point about what do you think would be the challenges towards something like that, right? I mean,